This is a lecture on Aristotle's ethics, but I will place some emphasis on certain features of Aristotle's general philosophy, especially his metaphysics, that are of particular relevance to his ethics. I will not spend too much time.
I think you need to move a bit closer to the microphone.
Okay. Can you get this closer?
Yeah, just move a bit closer. Yeah.
All right. Can you hear me in the back? Is that fine? Okay. I will not spend too much time on Aristotle's life and work and influence. I'm sure you are all aware of how enormously influential Aristotle has been. The list of topics he dealt with, not simply as an amateur, he dealt with them and expressed the state of the art at that time. So he, as is often said, is perhaps the last person, or maybe the only person, of whom it could be correctly said that he was the top of all fields of his knowledge and culture. This doesn't happen out of the blue, of course. There were 2 centuries of exciting developments in civilization, particularly the century just preceding Aristotle's, the 5th century. You've studied Plato and Socrates and have a sense of how important this century was. The age of Pericles, the golden age of Athens. We owe a lot for what we know about some of these pre-Socratic philosophers to Aristotle. His method was whenever he dealt with a subject, he will survey all past contributions. So in many cases, we owe a good deal of what we know about pre-Socratic philosophers, in particular to Aristotle. And what he said of them has been corroborated by independent evidence. So he wasn't simply playing around with history and just making it fit his own program. I will only make one comment, which is very important from the point of view of understanding the discipline of philosophy and what philosophy is all about, and what sort of progress one can expect to have philosophy as a discipline produce. Aristotle was a great scientist as well as a great philosopher. He was particularly good as a biologist. He spent a good deal of time observing in Ionia, in the Eastern Mediterranean, and in the 19th century, an authority, of course, no one would ignore that, would challenge that. Darwin said Aristotle was the greatest biologist that ever lived. Maybe this is an exaggeration, but the point I want to make is that we don't study Aristotle's biology. We are way, way ahead of it. It's part of the history of science. We don't read Aristotle's biology as state of the art. But we still speak about his ethics, as we now are doing, about his politics, about his theory and rhetoric. His logic was the dominant logic all the way to the 19th century. And it's still, many features of it are still very valid, pertinent, and are taught. So, I begin, as I promised, with pointing out a few crucial ideas that you may have come across if you took some of the baccalaureate programs on the secondary school. You maybe have heard of potentiality, actuality, and so on. My aim, as I try to explain, is to connect what he says in those metaphysical views, if you wish, and his ethics. The reason this is important has to do a lot with what we mean by a philosopher presenting a system. Aristotle presented a worldview, a very powerful perspective, a way of looking at the entirety of things. So he is not quotable in terms of insights, and they had many of those, as there are many eclectic philosophers, as they're called, who dealt with one thing and another, but had no this powerful vision I'm trying to emphasize. There is an Aristotelian way of looking at almost anything. That is why what he says in his worldview about final causes, about his theory about the soul, what we now call psychology, has a lot to do with understanding his ethics. So without any further ado, I'll begin to focus on three selected features of Aristotle's general philosophy, if you wish, and show how they bear upon his views on ethics. So we're on Roman numeral 3. This is the three selected topics I want to deal with. Teleology, this comes from the Greek term telos, meaning end, objective, purpose. Aristotelian worldview views the world as an interconnected series of potentialities being realized into actualities. Everything is for a reason. To understand the order of things, we have to understand the reasons behind not only the general order, but each particular thing is striving to attain an end. This is perhaps best captured and hopefully understood by the famous four causes that he presented. To understand anything, any existing thing, any substance, we need to understand four things about it, Aristotle says. We have to know what its material cause is. So he gives examples of artifacts, like houses and statues. For example, a statue is made out of marble. So without the marble, the statue could not have been. So we need to understand that in order to understand what the statue is. The marble needed an efficient cause. The sculptor and the chisel and applying to the marble and giving it the form it acquires. So the efficient cause is also essential for understanding why this thing is what it is and how it came about to be what it is. Then there's the formal cause. You may, those of you who are engineering students, the distinction between what the architect does and what the civil engineer does. The architect provides the form. You don't begin about building a house without knowing what the form that will ultimately this house have. So we need for, in the case of the sculptor, do you want to have the figure of a man on a horseback? You want to have a figure of Aphrodite or whatever form you wish to impart on the marble. That is part of the cause and necessary in order to understand how the statue or house came about to be what it is. He didn't stop there, however, as one may think or maybe believe he should have. He made a further assumption. He said that to understand fully what an object is, we have to understand what he calls its final cause. This is a typically Aristotelian contribution, if you wish. Why is it that this sculptor wanted to produce this particular statue? Is it a statue of Athena to be put on the Acropolis? Is it going to be a portrait of a well-known man? Or whatever the reason, the cause, the final cause, the object behind constructing it. So the Aristotelian worldview is a teleological worldview in this sense, that there are purposes behind everything. And to understand fully the world, we have to know what these purposes are. This is also related to the doctrine of potentiality and actuality. For the purpose of economy of time, I'll use an example which Aristotle gives to illustrate this point. He gives the example of the acorn, the baluta. The campus is full of them these days. The acorn and the oak tree. The acorn, in actuality, is what it is at a given point. It has some nutrient value, it has a certain taste, weight, and so on. But potentially, it is an oak tree. Now, what is very, very important about this analogy and the doctrine of potentiality and actuality, as far as ethics is concerned, and education and related matters, is what conditions are necessary in order to ensure that what exists potentially in something is realized in actuality. In order for the acorn to become an oak tree, it has to fall on the proper soil, needs moisture, it needs sunlight, it needs an environment that protects it so no one steps on it. We don't have the goats eating it, or when it grows, someone chopping it to make charcoal, whatever reasons are. The process of ensuring that the acorn becomes this towering oak tree requires an environment which sustains it, which protects it, and which provides it with the necessary condition for its growth and survival. He gives the analogy in education, how to make sure that the child grows to be a certain person. This is at the core of his virtue ethics, about which we will speak in some more detail. The main objective of any community, not just the parents and people immediately responsible for the well-being of the child, an entire community has an important responsibility to ensure that the children grow up to be appropriate, good citizens. And the two, being a morally good person and being a good citizen, are interlinked. Ethics and politics feed one another, and they are extremely important components of Aristotle's contribution in this area. As we say in Arabic, we want to make sure that the child grows up to be insan fadil, virtuous human person, wa muwatin salih, and a good citizen. And the two go together. So the idea of potentiality and actuality is something that helps us understand some of the driving forces behind Aristotle's virtue ethics as he developed it. His theory of the soul. The term for soul in Greek is psyche. So sometimes in histories of philosophy, when you divide Aristotle's various fields of inquiry, there is Aristotle's psychology. Sometimes they say theory of the soul. So he, in line with Plato, his teacher, is trying to really provide us with ways of classifying things and understanding the difference between one thing and another. So the difference between a stone and a carrot or a flower is that the flower or the carrot has the ability to grow and to get nourishment from the soil, which the stone doesn't. So the difference between the stone and the flower is that the flower has this vegetative soul, as Plato called it. Then the difference between the carrot and the rabbit that eats it. The rabbit has an animal soul or spirited soul, which provides locomotion and explains those characteristics that animals have, but plants do not. Now, in the genus animal, and Aristotle invented these terms, genus, species, and so on. He was a great classifier. So to understand the difference between the species of the genus animal, we have to locate the differentia. What is it that distinguishes one species from other species? So in the case of the human species, it is rationality. The title of this lecture that I chose to give, Aristotle's Ethics, the primacy of reason. So this is one way of understanding what Aristotle is trying to say about ethics. And you can connect this to his this manner of classification in his theory of the soul. He simplified Plato's theory of the soul into two, the rational and the non-rational, or the irrational. So again, if we keep in mind that what makes the human species different from other species is the possession of rationality, rationality becomes the human excellence. So the idea of a differentia, something which may seem to be neutral property to capture the distinctive characteristics of one species and sets it apart from other species, acquires value intonation. They become something desirable, not only something that makes it different and explains its specificity, it makes it something desirable. So if you are to achieve that which is unique and important and perhaps superior about being a human, you have to cultivate the rational capacity. And this is, as we shall see, is also connected to his ethics. So these three doctrines, the doctrine about final causes, potentiality and actuality, and the theory of the soul, his psychology, feed into our understanding, helps us understand many of the features of Aristotle's ethics. I move on now to develop section number 4, Roman numeral 4, the primacy of reason and the virtues. Excuse me. So we established that rationality is unique to human beings, it's a human excellence. And so now he identifies the role of reason. He identifies the role of reason in order to control our behavior. And the best means of controlling our behavior and regulating it is to deal with the emotions. So if we take an example, the emotion of fear. Too much fear is not desirable. We may have to take certain risks sometimes depending on the purposes we want to achieve. So if you are too fearful, you are a coward. And that's a vice. That's not a virtue. Okay. On the other hand, if you have little fear and you're not fearful when you should be, that too is not desirable. You're being rash. Okay. So virtue, this is the famous golden mean of Aristotle. Virtue is a mean between two extremes. One extreme to the side of deficiency, the other to the side of excess. So we should try to strike a middle road, and if we do so, then we can explain all these virtues. And in the Nicomachean Ethics, there's an implicit account of all these virtues. This is a classic account of virtues, whether it's courage, honesty. There is a very long chapter on friendship, is a classic treatment of the idea of loyalty and friendship and so on. So, but that's his general formula. So the virtues, generosity, courage, and so on, are means between two extremes. It is important to keep in mind that Aristotle did not locate the mean in the exact middle. So to give an analogy from space, if you have 100 units of length from 0 to 100, the mean is not on the 50th one. They're not necessarily. Exactly how close to the mean, to the center, is the mean depends, as Aristotle calls, on perception. This is the contextual character of Aristotle, from the term context. It's a situational ethics. We do not decide ahead of time the degree of risk worth taking in a given situation. That may depend on the situation. It may require caution and not taking much risk, or it may require taking more risk depending on what is to be saved or the end to be achieved. Determining exactly where the mean lies and what therefore a virtuous person who has the virtue of courage or generosity or whatever example you're taking, to determine the exact mean depends on the context. A very important feature of Aristotle to be added to his conception of virtues in ethics, which I'll explain a bit more, is something uniquely Aristotelian, which he translated as practical wisdom, practical reason. There is a special capacity that a human being possesses, and it develops with experience, the ability to identify the morally salient features of a situation. What sort of aspect of a situation have relevance to our moral life and moral values. This is something that cannot be taught exactly the way we learn other skills, but it's very important, essential for a human being to develop. We have examples of people who may not be terribly educated or not educated at all, who learn from experience, who can see through individuals and situation, and give the kind of advice that others who do not possess this practical wisdom have. This becomes essential to understand Aristotle's ethics, especially when the objection to this approach is often faced in those terms. How do we know exactly what we should do, how much courage to exhibit, what risks to take, how much to contribute, what is the mean that the virtue of generosity should have? Aristotle, again, would say that will depend on the context, on the kind of person that you have become. So how do we become the kind of person that we desire to become and we would like our children to become? So let's speak a bit more specifically, more clearly about the virtues. The virtues are character traits to begin with. خصائص طبع. These become who we are. Okay. And these character traits are predispositions to act in a certain way. If you have the virtue of the generosity, you are predisposed to help when your help is needed. If you have the virtue of courage, you would be predisposed to take risks if the ends justify taking this risk. So the virtues are character traits. So are vices. The difference between vices and virtues is that the virtues are character traits that lead us to do good things, and the vices are also predispositions to act in certain ways, character traits that lead us to do undesirable things. So again, the objective that we are trying to achieve in a community is to make sure that the child grows up to possess those virtues, those desirable, good character traits. So this is now called virtue ethics. Is essentially Aristotelian ethics. Yeah, I don't know how much you've read maybe Plato and Socrates, but normative ethical theories attempts to define what we ought to do, how do we decide what the right thing to do, can be divided into those that rely heavily on principles, like utilitarianism, the principle of utility, choose the course of action that leads to the realization of the best balance of good of happiness over unhappiness, or an approach such as Kant's called deontologist, where you identify certain duties that we must tell the truth, and we therefore are guided by categorical imperatives and so on. We need not go into that. The refreshing thing about Aristotle's ethics, and for the last 70 years or so, since the mid-century, last centuries, the dominant ethical theory, or at least a very, very solid alternative theory, has been Aristotelian ethics. This is what I meant earlier when I said that the difference between biology as a science and areas such as ethics and politics is that they address the human condition in a manner that would remain relevant as long as the human condition and human nature have not in any radical way changed. So Aristotelian ethics is very much alive now, and very much the state of the art. because of this attempt to focus on making sure that we not only become the right person, the sort of person who has the virtues, but also that we live in a community of people who also possess these virtues. This is very essential for Aristotle. This, again, is how ethics and politics are tied together or feed into one into the other. Okay. All right, so how do we acquire these virtues? We've put the general formula, the priority of a community with its own institutions, beginning with the family, the school, and so on. The priority should be to provide the best conditions that will nurture the potentials in the child to have these predispositions to act in the right way, these virtues. How do we achieve that? He emphasizes habit. Predispositions to act in a certain way require training, habit. You can make analogies with sports. To become a good swimmer, before someone is an Olympic swimmer, it required hours and hours of training, and so that you perform the right motion in the proper way, in the right way, so it looks like a second nature. You glide over the surface of the water as if this is a machine. All right, so this requires habit. Of course, not every person has the potential to become an Olympic swimmer. Not every person has the potential to become a concert pianist. So playing the piano, another type of skill, also requires proper training and habit. He gives the example of the lyre, playing the lyre. At the end of the fly sheet that you have, I have quotations from Aristotle. You may become a bad lyre player if you have been conditioned and practiced to play it in the wrong way, or you become a good player if you have the conditioning and training to do it in the right way. This applies to everything. It applies to ethics. So the example of role model, again, in the family and the community, making it a matter of second nature. You do not become a generous person, or we cannot correctly say that you possess the virtue of generosity if occasionally you give something. A generous person would always be willing to give under the right conditions in the appropriate way. The person who has the honesty or integrity, virtue of integrity, will always be truthful, will always not accept bribes and so on, not occasionally. So if these are to become character traits, second nature, it therefore requires having the potential and the training and conditioning that goes with it. So there are a number of assumptions that he makes here. He assumes that we are all educable. You can work on the child, educate the child, to instill in the child the proper virtues. It also may vary to some degree, but this is a complexity we need not go into. Very, very few people have the potential to become Olympic swimmers. But most people can learn to float and swim in some way or the other. So he acknowledges the important differences. Again, to go back to his influence on education, it becomes essential to discover what our children are good at or bad at. A good counselor, especially in the early stages, would be able to advise the student and the parent what capacities, what potential this child has. So we don't torture our children who may be artistically inclined and may have a lot of talent in that direction to make them engineers or whatever it is that we think they should be. Okay. So this is part of the type of attraction or attractiveness that Aristotelian approach had. Establish the potential of the child and nourish it. You have a happy child, and your chances of succeeding at instilling the appropriate traits are greater. As far as ethics is concerned, he assumes that we all have the potential of being good. We are not, as we now say, psychopaths or sociopaths. Fortunately, this is a very small minority of people who, for some reason, simply lack the ability to distinguish right and wrong, have no moral sense at all. But the predominant majority of human beings are educable in this sense and could therefore be taught to become honest, courageous, and all that. We are also, and this is a very important assumption that he shared with his culture, with the classical Greek culture, we are, as human beings, we are social animals, we are social beings. It's in our nature to be social. I think you still read the Iliad of Homer, going back to community. As long as you are away from your community, as long as you don't belong to a community, you are not really fully human. So the trip back home is to recover one's humanity and so on. So this is a very important doctrine that the classical Greek philosophy accepted. There are those who, it is still a powerful way of looking at it. If you take CS203, and I urge you to do that, you will read Hobbes, for example. Hobbes believes that we are by nature, we're not social by nature, we become social by necessity. We have to instill missing motives. We have to be talked into becoming social because it is in our interest to do so, not because we are by nature social beings. All right, so these are the basic assumptions he makes. We are social beings. Human beings are educable. We have various potentials. He gives an interesting example of wasting our time. If we try to train a stone to fly by throwing it in the air, the 100,000th time would not increase the chances that the stone would have learned how to fly. If we know anything about the stone, we know that the stone cannot fly. So these are the rules of thumb that he provides, and from then on, the course is clear. Let us work on providing the appropriate environment for our children to become إنسان فاضل ومواطن صالح. Okay. Eudaimonia, well-being or happiness. One of the beginning sentence, I think it's part of the assigned material for you in the Nicomachean Ethics, that every action aims at some good. Now, Aristotle develops a theory of value, or what philosophers call, and others, a theory of value. A theory about what sorts of things are valuable, what sorts of things are good, desirable, we like to have and have more of. And he makes a very important distinction between intrinsic good and extrinsic good. To have a theory of value, not everything, not the value of everything can be instrumental or extrinsic. If you value A because A leads to attainment of B, the value of A is instrumental. It's an instrument, a means of getting something else, B. Its value is extrinsic, it's outside of it. Why do we value B? If it also turns out that B is valuable because it leads to C, again, the value of B is extrinsic. So Aristotle says that we need, if we are to have a coherent theory of value, we have to have at least one type of thing which is intrinsically valued. It's good in and of itself. If you are a hedonist, for example, you believe that the only thing which is desirable intrinsically is pleasure. The value of everything else is proportional to how it leads us to the attainment of pleasure. so you can construct a theory of value. The question then arises if, as Aristotle says, every action aims at some good. When you do intentional acts as a human being, the intention, the reason for committing an act, the purpose of your behaving as you do, is the attainment of some good. And if what is intrinsically good is happiness, or eudaimonia, as the Greeks called it, the question arises: is this a type of hedonism, at least in the sense in which some negative associations have been given to it? Now, it's interesting what Aristotle says here, and how he links it to his theory of virtue. Don't focus on, don't be obsessed and overwhelmed with the attainment of pleasure, he says. Focus on being virtuous. Be the kind of person who has these character traits, and then you will be happy. Or so he assumes. So pleasure, as he puts it, accompanies, bilazim, birafi, accompanies virtuous activity. So the act of courage that you perform as a courageous person, especially if it's successful, gives you a sense of pleasure, a sense of fulfillment, sense of culmination. Okay, but don't focus on the pleasures. It is really a very bad way of seeking happiness and pleasure. Right? Sometimes we tell our students, don't worry about the grade, try to understand the material, and then you will get a good grade. So there is some, if you want, folk wisdom in that, but there is nothing, you shouldn't put that down. So these are complex issues. I'm trying to present the bare outline of that, so you may want to build around that. Okay. Number 6 on this is what we now call professional ethics. If you are biology or chemistry or other majors who intend to go to medicine, you would have most medical schools, fortunately, happily, including our medical school here, a component of the curriculum of medical students is medical ethics. So you will find that Aristotle's brand of virtue ethics is the most attractive and perhaps dominant view that has immediate relevance to medical ethics. It is true of all professional ethics, not just simply medical ethics. Aristotle uses the term practice for a profession. So medicine is a practice. Any type of activity that presupposes mastery of a body of knowledge and development of certain skills that achieve certain desirable ends. You could be a carpenter, or a surgeon, or a navigator, or a farmer. So these practices, as you call them, or professions, if you wish, have their own appropriate ethical codes. Adab al-mihni, as we say in Arabic. Okay. So what is his contribution there? I'll give you an example. In his theory of value, when he speaks about the good and distinguishes intrinsic and extrinsic, he also asks a question about the good of a given practice or profession. شو الفايدة منه؟ شو بنستفيد؟ شو النتيجة؟ What value do you achieve by becoming an engineer or an accountant or a doctor? So this is the question he raises. And he makes a distinction between goods that are internal to the practice and goods that are external to the practice. For example, you want to become a physician. This is one of the examples he gives. Okay, what reason do you have in becoming a physician? What good do you hope to achieve? Well, you want to live comfortably and become wealthy. Azim, Sahsena Albak. Aristotle was a realist. He doesn't take it against you that you want wealth. But he says, you must realize that if you were to become a merchant, or so he believes at least, your chances of getting wealthy are much greater than going into medicine. Now, you may challenge that now, Mabarif. Okay, so at least he assumed that if wealth is what you are about, this is what matters for you, شو بدك تعمل حكيم؟ التاجر. Okay, go into a field that would ensure that you'll become a wealthy person. You want to become famous and well known? Okay, again, Azim, this is a normal human desire, but he says, ما تغير كثير الأشياء, become a general or a politician, Pericles, for example, or whatever. So fame and notoriety and being recognized in public, if that's what you want, you are in the wrong profession. So what is it that is the good which is intrinsic to medicine? Alleviating suffering, helping, curing, and so on. These are things that you can do best that others cannot do for an ill person, a person who needs help, and so on. So you can have a sense of why Aristotle's virtue ethics seems to be attractive in professional ethics. The same thing applies in other professions, not just medicine. Now I get in the remaining 10 minutes or so to section 6. The contemporary relevance of Aristotle's ethics. I've been driving in that direction in my remarks up till now, but I want to focus on a very significant feature of Aristotle's ethics, which again explains why he is still considered to be of relevance to the present time. Why is Aristotelian ethics of relevance in this sense? What is its contemporary relevance? And the best way, as I see it, to understand this point is to distinguish between two types of questions that Aristotle distinguishes very clearly. The first question has to do with how do we determine what we ought to do? What is the right thing to do? That's a very important question. It's clearly a philosophical question that interested and continues to interest philosophers and others. There is, however, another important question. For Aristotle, it was perhaps more important. How to get people to do what they ought to do. And his insight that he had here, which appeals to common sense, is that in most cases, we don't argue about whether things like murdering someone or cheating or putting on the market medications that have expired or selling food that is no longer good for consumption, doing things that you know are wrong, that everybody knows is wrong. We don't need any services of the philosopher or anyone else to tell us that these things are wrong. What do we need then? We have to make sure that the child who grows up to be this merchant or this pharmacist or whoever who does these clearly wrong things, that we don't have any of those, or as few as possible, by instilling the appropriate virtues. The fact that there are people who do these things show that something has gone wrong in the process of education and upbringing and instilling the appropriate character traits in our children. All right, so I put here in bold, but we do not try to prove that these things are wrong. But what we should do, that when they are detected, that they are punished. Okay? We've heard of many scandals in recent memory. Anyone has been punished? No. It's not only the fault of those who do these things. There will always be some who will do these things. But there's something also wrong when these people do it and get away with it and are protected. هذا بيطلعهم من الحبس or whatever, if they ever go there. Okay. So Aristotle says there is something wrong when that too. Wrong about the community in this generalized sense. We should work at preventing that. How do we prevent that? Now, there are short-term solutions and long-term solutions. To take examples of contemporary relevance, the long-term solution, للنفايات, to have the right habits. So, نعمل فرز على المسطر, whatever. We develop the necessary education school. Some suggested, let us begin بالمدرسة الابتدائية. Let's go to the children, teach them the value. So they watch over their parents and tell them, no, mommy, don't throw the garbage, or whatever. طيب عظيم. This is a good beginning. This is a long-term solution, very much in line with Aristotle's emphasis on instilling the right habits. Okay. However, in the meantime, we need immediate solution. But then okay. Now, you find these things directly and by implications if you read the sense of Aristotle. So, and this is also related to what he says about practical wisdom, this important additional virtue about which very few have spoken. So the importance of Aristotle, I repeat, is that he distinguished between these two types of questions. Maybe if we focus only on the second question, the role of the philosopher may become secondary. So be it. And if doctors have less work because people have the right eating habits and so on, معلش, we can do with less doctors. The role here becomes to the educators, to the psychologists, and various other. Aristotle's contribution to moral education, moral psychology is incredible. If you don't know that he lived in the 4th century BC, you think that someone, a contemporary writer, is writing about these things. In economics, there are psychologists and some philosophers dealt with these things who call certain laws the Aristotelian law. A very prominent philosophers and economists did that. So there is a wealth of insights that you can find in what this man said about the human condition and the prescription he gave it to address this particular flaw or something that needs to be addressed. In conclusion, look at I've added to the lecture 2 quotations from Aristotle. I've referred to one of them about playing the musical instrument. And I've also included part of an entry in the Routledge Encyclopedia of Philosophy on virtue ethics that does credit to Aristotle. Thank you very much. Some of you have been very patient.